Amendments ensure the legislation is in line with the Commemorative Works Act by requiring the design of the statue be approved by the General Services Administration prior to its installation. I support passage of this legislation as amended and urge my colleagues to do the same. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, sir. I should yield myself 3 minutes or as much time as I consume, whichever comes first.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, sir. I rise in support of H.R. 1264, which designates the property between the United States Courthouse and the Ed Jones Federal Building in Jackson, Tennessee as M.D. Anderson Plaza. Ed Jones was a congressman who preceded Mr. Fincher in that district and preceded Mr. Tanner. And he had the slogan, Ed Jones from the heart of the country, or the heart of the district with the district at his heart. Quite a fine man. This bill authorizes the placement of a historical marker and a statue on the grounds recognizing the achievements and the philanthropic good deeds of M.D. Anderson. Born in 1873 in Jackson, Mr. Anderson, who was known as M.D. Anderson, was a successful businessman, farmer, and philanthropist. He went to college in Memphis. Smart man he was to go to Memphis, then called Southern Baptist, that I believe became Union in Jackson, Tennessee. And after he was in Memphis and had that opportunity, he moved back to Jackson and went to work in his family-owned business, good choice, and went in the cotton business with his older brother Frank and Frank's brother-in-laws. And they became the largest cotton company in the world, according to Fortune magazine, in 1945. In 1936, M.D. Anderson created a charitable foundation that bore his name and funded it with an initial investment of $300,000, a considerable amount of money at that time, not a bad amount of money today. After his death, the trustees of M.D. Anderson's estate directed an additional $19 million toward his foundation, and that helped create M.D. Anderson's lasting legacy by providing seed funds for the University of Texas M.D. Anderson Cancer Center, which is one of the world's leaders in cancer research and treatments, and thankfully people who I know have had the opportunity to be treated there. It's a great clinic, and it's the best place to go if you've got cancer and have that opportunity to be treated by the world's greatest professionals there in Houston. M.D. Anderson is considered to be the father of that institution, and because his charitable foundation matched the initial state funds for a Texas-based cancer research and treatment center, he is given that appellation. His charitable foundation also funded and supported libraries and college buildings, including ones at Lambeth College in Jackson, now known as Lambeth University of Memphis, and planetariums also in the city of Jackson, and his adopted hometown of Houston, Texas. Given his lasting and significant contributions to his communities, and really to the world with the M.D. Anderson Cancer Clinic, which is the finest cancer clinic, I suspect, in the world, it's fitting that we honor his commitment by giving the plaza between the two federal buildings his name. Some might question our taking time at this Congress and this floor when we have so many things going on to do this, but this is the type of activity that will hopefully inspire others to use their good fortune and or good works to help others in situations as dire as having cancer, and M.D. Anderson did that. So it's a commendable piece of legislation, and I'm happy that Mr. Fincher brought it to the floor, and I'm happy to support it, and I urge my colleagues in supporting H.R. 1264 and memorializing this gentleman. And I would yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. And thank my colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for support of this, and my colleague from Middle Tennessee for his support as well. My bill, H.R. 1264, will rename the plaza between the two federal buildings in Jackson, Tennessee, located in the 8th Congressional District, after Monroe Dunaway Anderson, a true hero to millions of people who have been diagnosed with cancer. For those who don't know M.D. Anderson, he was born and raised in Jackson, Tennessee during the late 19th century. In 1904, after completing college and spending a few years working as a banker in Memphis, M.D. Anderson joined a cotton trading venture started by his older brother Frank Anderson and Frank's brother-in-law, Will Clayton. Their corporation, Anderson, Clayton and Company, flourished due to the rising demand of cotton during World War I. They eventually moved the business to Houston, Texas, to have better access to deep water shipping. By the 1920s, their operation had trading offices in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The company continued to succeed through the 1930s and 40s, diversifying its capital into a marine insurance company, a barge line, cotton mills, an investment bank, machine works, and even a foods division. By 1950, Anderson, Clayton and Company was a multi-million-dollar corporation, and their international market sales reached 3.5% of all the world's cotton production. But we're not standing here tonight to honor M.D. Anderson because of his incredible success and contributions to agribusiness. Many would keep the fruits of their labor for themselves, but M.D. Anderson had others in mind. In 1936, he established a charitable foundation with $300,000, and upon his death in 1939, the foundation received an additional $19 million endowment. M.D. Anderson had a particular interest in health care, specifically in working to find a cure for cancer. Trustees of the foundation kept M.D. Anderson's interest and passions in mind as they decided how to use the foundation's endowment after his death. Funding from the foundation helped to start the Texas Medical Center in Houston, Texas, which is the largest medical complex in the world. Funding was also used to establish the M.D. Anderson Cancer Center at the Texas Medical Center, which is one of the world's most respected centers devoted exclusively to cancer patient care, research, education, and prevention. Since 1944, nearly 900,000 patients have turned to M.D. Anderson for cancer care. In addition to medical research, the M.D. Anderson Foundation has built libraries, auditoriums, college buildings, and a planetarium on the campus of Lambeth College in Jackson, Tennessee. We honor M.D. Anderson today, not because of his success in agribusiness, but because of his generosity and interest in bettering the lives of others. I want to take a moment to thank the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Norton, for her support and for working with me on the language in this bill. I also want to recognize the hard work of Mayor Jerry Gist of Jackson, the Jackson City Council, Madison County Mayor Jimmy Harris, and the Madison County Commission. And finally, I want to specifically thank Mr. Dickie Day of Jackson, Tennessee, and Mr. Carter Edwards of Murray City, Tennessee, for their efforts to ensure the life and achievements of M.D. Anderson are memorialized in his hometown of Jackson, Tennessee. It's an honor to sponsor this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1264 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no.
Vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present.
In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present, and I make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. The Chair will now entertain requests for one-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina rise?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to speak of the remarkable life of my friend Gene Rossich of Winston-Salem. Gene died last week at age 77 after a tenacious fight with cancer. One of the remarkable things about Gene is that he grew up in Cuba and fled to the U.S. with his family in 1962 in search of freedom. Despite being uprooted and transplanted into a new culture and nation, he thrived in Winston-Salem, forging a successful 30-year career at Wachovia Bank. But Gene was more than just a successful businessman. He was passionate about investing in the community, which he went about with gusto during the nearly 50 years he made his mark on the community of Winston-Salem. He leaves behind a shining example of helping others, from serving as a volunteer translator for the police and court system to serving with the Red Cross to volunteering on the board of a local Catholic high school. Gene also lived a vibrant life of faith, serving in numerous ways in his local church, Our Lady of Mercy, for decades. decades. His life demonstrated to those who knew him that he was a man of conviction, steadfast faith, and unrivaled dedication to his community and those in need. He will be greatly missed, and his passing is a terrible loss to his family and loved ones, as well as the entire Winston-Salem community. Mr. Speaker, my prayers are with his family and many friends who are mourning the loss of a man of kindness and remarkable character. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. And for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court is the most important court in the world. However, very few citizens have the chance to watch the Supreme Court in action when historic lawsuits come before it. This is because the seating in the courtroom is limited. The Supreme Court will soon take up the health care bill and rule on its constitutionality. This monumental case affects every single American, yet only a select group will be able to attend the hearing. Representative Jerry Conley has introduced legislation that I support to allow cameras in the Supreme Court. A single non-intrusive type camera controlled by the court staff would allow for greater access in the decisions made by the 9 jurists in black robes. I know cameras can be placed in a courtroom without disruption because I was one of the first judges in Texas to allow cameras to film criminal cases. A lack of seating capacity is no reason to deny the American people the right to see Supreme Court proceedings. The American people deserve an all-access pass to watch the High Court rule on the law of the land. And that's just the way it is.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to give voice to a concern that I have heard raised from numerous constituents who originally hail from Belarus. Since 1994, President Lukashenko has abused his power and has actively worked to undermine the freedom of the Belarusian people. Recently, the State Department released a report on the human rights situation in Belarus. And under this authoritarian regime, Belarusians have been subject to manipulated elections and oppression on the basis of political affiliation, ethnicity, and religious beliefs. Following the most recent election, security forces arrested political activists, presidential candidates, and journalists. Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable that this kind of oppression exists today in Europe, and I hope that more Americans will be made aware of the tyranny in Belarus. I thank the Belarusian American Youth Association for bringing this issue to my attention, and I stand with my constituents in support of freedom for the Belarusian people in opposition to this oppressive regime. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence is requested for Mr. Berman of California for today, Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island for today, Mr. Coble of North Carolina for today, Mr. Davis of Illinois for today, Mr. Griffith of Virginia for today, Mr. Gutierrez of Illinois for today and the balance of the week, Mr. Heinrich of New Mexico for today, Mr. Marino of Pennsylvania for today, Ms. Napolitano of California for today and Tuesday, December 13th until 5 p.m., and Ms. Sewell of Alabama for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So much going on these days, and we have to trust the United States, the federal entities of the executive branch, to keep us protected. That's why our hearing last week with the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, before the Judiciary Committee of the House was very disturbing. We had the Attorney General Holder before our committee back May the 3rd of this year, and at that time the Attorney General said
With regard to this horrible project, undertaking called Fast and Furious, the Attorney General said he had only known about it, quote, a few weeks, unquote. To most of us, a few weeks means about 3 weeks. However, in testifying under penalty of perjury last week, the Attorney General said, in essence, look, 3 weeks, 3 months, a few weeks is 3 months. There's not really any difference. When you have the highest ranking person in the Department of United States Justice who plays so fast and loose with testifying under oath, who plays so fast and loose with the facts, it is quite disturbing, and it's time for a change. Our Attorney General testified that there were a certain number of guns, 94,000 firearms, submitted for tracing, and that 64,000 of those firearms were sourced to the United States. The further we get into that, the more inaccurate we find out those figures are. And of course, we recall, and it's understandable that with a boss like the United States President, who has previously said 95% of the guns seized at crime scenes in Mexico came from the United States, it's understandable that if the boss is making those kind of glaring errors on numbers, then perhaps the head of the Department of Justice would make substantial mistakes in numbers. But fortunately, the Department of Justice is not the only source of information regarding those type of matters. The Congressional Research Service is a bipartisan group. They do an extraordinary job. I've gotten the impression that potentially majority may be Democrat, but it doesn't matter to those folks. They do a very good job of researching thoroughly whatever project they're given. And the information that we were able to get back from the Congressional Research Service indicates that there are maybe only 25% of the weapons that Mexico has seized that are capable of being traced back to their original source, and that most of the weapons that Mexico seizes are never offered for the process of tracing because they know there's no way to trace them. So if only 25% of those that are seized in Mexico are asked to have tracing done, then it is very clear that not 95, not 90, not even 70% of the weapons seized can be traced to an American owner first. We also know from the testimony and the information about this Fast and Furious project of the ATF, Department of Justice, because the ATF is a subsidiary of the Department of Justice. But we know that gun dealers were pushed into making sales to people they didn't believe should be sold the weapons. And our own federal government, our own Justice Department, urged them to go ahead and make the sales on behalf of their country anyway. Then some in this administration have the nerve to say this too was Bush's fault. And they point to programs in the Bush administration as being the source. Andrew McCarthy, back November 8th, had a great article entitled, and this is National Review Online, Fast and Furious was ... Bush's fault. And he goes on, of course, to point out Fast and Furious did not begin until 2009, months after the end of the Bush administration. And he also goes on to point out a number of things. For example, Wide Receiver, which was a project under the Bush administration, involved what were considered controlled deliveries. As a former judge, we heard testimony constantly about controlled deliveries, where the government would have people find out people were inquiring about making drug sales, and they would set up a delivery. There would be plenty of agents there to intervene as soon as the transaction had actually been made. The controlled delivery meant not only do you have people watching, you may even have some way to follow the transfer of what's being transferred in that controlled delivery. That is what was anticipated with Wide Receiver, the project under the Bush administration. And unfortunately, there was an incident where Wide Receiver, apparently that project had a controlled delivery setup of weapons, the intent never ever to allow them to actually leave this country or to actually have the individuals involved get away with those weapons, but actually to have them have an interdiction, have them arrested. But unfortunately, and also one other thing, they had homing devices on the weapons. Well, unfortunately, everything went wrong. The homing devices were detected, they were removed, the controlled delivery went bad, and folks got away. That is a far sight different from this administration just deciding we're going to see that massive number, at least a couple of thousand weapons are put in the hands of criminals who will likely take them across the border. They will certainly end up in the deaths of Mexicans, and there's a good chance will result in the death of Americans. Anyone in any administration who thinks such an idea is a good one needs to go from that administration. Anyone from any administration who allows something so insane to take place does not need to be in that administration. Anybody who has such lax control over his department that though those directly under him know about it, they leave him plausible deniability to come in and say, I didn't know anything about it. Maybe Lanny Brewer, yeah, apparently he knew all about it, but hey, yeah, I see Lanny quite a bit, but I didn't know anything about it. Anybody that sets up a structure to allow themselves that kind of plausible deniability, so-called plausible, and would allow something that results in a foreseen death, much less hundreds of deaths, does not need to be head of that department. Now, this should not be a partisan issue. Back when President Bush, George W. Bush, was president, we had been told in our Judiciary Committee in the House that by the Attorney General at that time that there were no known abuses of the National Security Letters. The National Security Letter powers bother me greatly. Extremely concerned about them, have been very concerned about them. And we had the report from the Attorney General, no, there's no known abuses. Well, that is an awfully powerful weapon, but we were assured under the Patriot Act it is only allowable that those letters be used to gain information about foreign nationals, not American citizens, or people who are associated with known foreign terrorist organizations. They would never be used against American citizens. We were assured that. So some of us wanted to make sure that there were no abuses. No American citizens were being pursued internationally or nationally. We were sure they weren't. The Attorney General in July had testified before, this was, I guess, 2007, I believe it was July, that there were no known abuses by federal agents of the National Security Letter, where they demand information, documentation, all that's in the possession of the person to whom the letter is sent. Turns out, 3 days before the Attorney General testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, there had been a report that was placed on his desk. The Attorney General's defense was, I never read it before I testified before the Senate, so I was certainly testifying honestly, I just didn't know. That was enough, though, to have people on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, House and Senate, agree something, we need a change. And we got a change within about 6 weeks. This administration is so used to obfuscating, hiding the ball, preventing documentation that's requested from coming to light. This administration thinks that it can keep protecting people who need to go for the good of the country. Then we find out there's emails in the documents that were provided by the Justice Department. There are emails indicating that, gee, maybe it would be a good idea if we could use fast and furious numbers to get more regulation. Cheryl Atkinson has an article. This was as part of CBSNews.com, when she indicates ATF officials didn't intend to publicly disclose their own role in letting Mexican cartels obtain the weapons, but emails show they discussed using the sales, including sales encouraged by ATF, to justify a new gun regulation called, quote, Demand Letter 3, unquote. That would require some U.S. gun shops to report the sale of multiple rifles or long guns. Demand Letter 3 was so named because it would be the third ATF program demanding gun dealers report tracing information. On July 14, 2010, after ATF headquarters in Washington, D.C., received an update on Fast and Furious, ATF Field Ops Assistant Director Mark Chait emailed Bill Newell, ATF's Phoenix Special Agent in charge of Fast and Furious, the following, quote, "Can you see if these guns were all purchased from the same licensed gun dealer and at one time? We are looking at anecdotal cases to support a demand letter on long gun multiple sales. Thanks," unquote. Amazing. The ATF, the Justice Department, creates this horrible program that would get people killed and then wants to use that as a basis for further regulation and further elimination of Second Amendment rights to the United States Constitution. Unbelievable. We have Senator Feinstein down the hall when questioning Lanny Breuer, who apparently indications are was not truthful with regard to Fast and Furious. And Senator Feinstein says, "We have very lax laws when it comes to guns. I think this, to some extent, influences the ATF in how they approach the problem as to whether they have political support or not. But I think these numbers are shocking. And I think when you know the numbers of deaths these guns have caused used by cartels against victims, it's in literally up in the tens of thousands. So the question comes is what we can do. And I'd really rather concentrate on the constructive rather than other things. And so the question comes, do you believe that if there were some form of registration when you purchase these firearms, that that would make a difference? Again, a deadly program that would kill innocent people is put in place by the Justice Department's ATF. People are killed, and then people around this town want to use this horrible program's results to justify taking away Second Amendment rights. It's staggering. Staggering. It's bad enough that anybody would think this type of program, Fast and Furious, was a good idea, but then to turn around and use it to try to destroy Second Amendment rights under the Constitution is simply unconscionable. Well, the Attorney General also, when asked about his testimony last week, he said yes, he had ordered in February an Inspector General inspection of the Fast and Furious program. When it was pointed out to the Attorney General that in the big document dump that they had, and it was clearly a document dump intended to mask and hide anything therein, a good piece of evidence of that is the fact that 92 pages at least of the documents were Senator Grassley's own request for information about Fast and Furious. Those were just duplicated dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and that was part of the document dump, just to hide what little bit of information was in there. And yet, despite all those documents produced, and despite information that was inquired about at the hearing, the Attorney General does use government email. He does use private email. He does sign things. Not one email of the Attorney General, not one letter, not one order of any kind by this Attorney General was part of that record. If we have an Attorney General who believes in playing so fast and loose with the laws that it really is more about who you know in this administration rather than what the law says, it's time for another Attorney General. Nothing was produced. When I asked about his testimony that an IG inspection was ordered, our Attorney General indicated basically that he had such a great relationship with the Inspector General, he could just pick up the phone and ask her to do an inspection, a study. If that's the way this Attorney General operates, which he testified under oath that it was, we need a new Attorney General. Those kind of things are so serious, they require something signed. And as far as being so chummy with the Inspector General, it also makes clear this is no way to run a Justice Department, because it makes clear that the Justice Department is run by a man who is so chummy with the one person that may be able to do an independent study that there really is no independent study done. That also became clear, and Darrell Issa, who has been pursuing this, and I'm thankful for it, he's been relentless, but the information has not been forthcoming. But from what information has been gleaned, we find out that this Inspector General the very, very, very close chum of our Attorney General, had found out that there was a gun dealer who became so concerned about this egregious thing being done where he was being forced to sell guns to people to whom he did not want to sell guns, that he began recording conversations, things that were told him by federal agents so that he would have some protection. When the Inspector General found out, she got the recorded conversations. Now, a good Inspector General who is not extremely chummy with the person heading up the department she's supposed to independently study and inspect would go forward, talk to witnesses, see if they said anything inconsistent in their statements to the Inspector General, so that the Inspector General could determine if these people were being honest. Instead, what this very close ally and chum of the person whose department she's supposed to be inspecting, she apparently took the recorded statement, gave it to the federal agent, and said, hey, you better listen to this before you give any statements so you can make sure your statements are consistent. Inspector Generals aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to conduct a thorough, independent investigation. All the indications are that this Inspector General is, just as Attorney General Holder testified, so chummy, so close, that she doesn't need a written order. It works out better if we can just say, we just talked about it over the phone. And in fact, wouldn't that be great, too, if we could do that here in Congress? You know what? We passed a law, but we just talked about it, and you don't get to find out what it is, but we'll come after you if you violate it. You can't run a government that way. There needs to be documentation for decisions that are made so we know who made it. And that brings us to one of the more egregious factors in the poor management of the Justice Department. When the Attorney General was asked who it was, by my friend Judge Poe from Texas, now in Congress, who it was that made the decision to go forward with Fast and Furious, after, lo, these many, many months, the Attorney General said he just really didn't know. Didn't know if he was going to be able to find out. Since we have an Attorney General that has no way of knowing who is making the decisions in his department that are getting innocent people in the United States and Mexico killed, it's time to have an Attorney General who does. We cannot survive as a country when the federal government plays so fast and loose with orders that mean the difference between people being killed and not killed. It's time for a change. America deserves better. Mexico deserves better. And you can't help but wonder what kind of pressure was put on Mexico's government not to raise holy Cain about having all these illegal weapons forcibly sold that were going into Mexico. We had no intention, or this Justice Department had no intention of following them, no method of getting them back, no method of finding out where they were. And in fact, it appears the whole goal was to wait and see when they showed up at crime scenes, which normally meant somebody had been killed, then check the serial numbers against those the ATF had forcibly required the sale of, and if they matched, then we could blame American gun dealers. It's understandable a gun dealer in the U.S. could become concerned that maybe he ought to start taping federal agents giving him instructions. Things are not going well in this Justice Department. One other area of concern has been for some time is the fact that there are organizations in the United States that are raising money and then funding terrorist organizations abroad. Hamas is one specifically. And since this government continues to send money to the Palestinian Authority, which has now got an agreement with Hamas, our own government's in cahoots in funding terrorism. At some point, the insanity's got to stop. We know that this kind of thing has gone on by organizations in the United States because in November of 2008, the Bush administration obtained 5 convictions, 105 counts of funding terrorism. Most people refer to the litigation as the Holy Land Foundation trial. And there were over 200 named co-conspirators with the Holy Land Foundation and the individuals named. And those co-conspirators, many of them were implicated through evidence that was introduced at trial in the Holy Land Foundation trial. Now, they were named co-conspirators, but the others were not actually indicted. My understanding that the Bush administration intended to try to get those first convictions. First time the case was tried to a hung jury, second 11-1 split as I understood it, for guilt. The second time they got the 105 counts of conviction against the 5 individuals. And that their intent was then if they could get that, those prosecutions, get those judgments, get those findings of guilt, then it would proceed on with others of the 200-plus named co-conspirators. And in fact, some of the named co-conspirators, like Kerr, Isna, had filed a motion with the federal court in Dallas that ended up at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans. They wanted their names struck from the pleadings. But the Fifth Circuit, in essence, said there's a prima facie case. There's sufficient evidence here to show that these named co-conspirators were co-conspirators, and therefore, no, they're not going to have their names struck from the pleadings. They're part of the evidence. It's clear, or there is evidence to support their being co-conspirators with the Holy Land Foundation. Some folks have been trying to get documentation from the Holy Land Foundation trial. We'd gotten some. But there was a massive amount of documents that were turned over to the 5 defendants, the Holy Land Foundation people. And since we know beyond a reasonable doubt they were funding terrorism, there's not really any doubt in most thinking people's minds that those documents all found their way back to Hamas, to terrorists. But this administration, led by Attorney General Eric Holder, has decided they're not going to prosecute any of those people. Even after the Fifth Circuit said there is prima facie evidence, there is sufficient evidence to go forward and to keep their names because they are co-conspirators according to the evidence produced. This administration has chosen to protect those individuals by not prosecuting them, much like this administration did in failing to prosecute the individuals involved in the new Black Panther movement, who one African American involved in the civil rights movement of the 60s said it was the worst case of voting rights abuses that he had ever seen. And yet this Attorney General, who could have gotten a judgment and prevented at least these two individuals from ever appearing at a voting place like this and intimidating voters, chose to water down the judgment with one so that he just didn't go back to that same voting place in the next election, and with the other, who was certainly from the videotape involved in violating people's civil rights, didn't even take the judgment against him. And then to turn around and refuse to prosecute people who are, there's sufficient evidence to show that they are funding terrorism, is horrendous. There is an article, December 7th, Holy Land Foundation, Hamas support convictions affirmed. And this is from Andrew McCarthy, who was the prosecutor in the first World Trade Center prosecution, 1993, when the attempt was made to blow up the World Trade Centers the first time, successfully prosecuted. And at the time, America didn't realize we were in a war. We were in a war, but only one side knew that they were in a war, and that was the radical Islamists. But anyway, as Mr. McCarthy indicates, the U.S. Court of Appeals, Fifth Circuit, upheld the convictions of 5 jihadists behind the Holy Land Foundation, the piggy bank set up by the Brotherhood in the U.S. under the guise of charity to fund Hamas to the tune of tens of millions of dollars during the deadly Intifada. The 3-judge panel's unanimous 170-page opinion recounts that Hamas was created by Brotherhood operatives, that's Muslim Brotherhood, operatives in 1987 as the Brotherhood's, quote, Palestinian branch, unquote. Thereafter, quote, the Muslim Brotherhood directed its worldwide chapters to establish so-called Palestinian committees to support Hamas from abroad, unquote. In the U.S., the Palestinian Committee was led by Musa Abu Marzouk, who for a time in the early 90s actually ran Hamas from his home in Virginia. The Palestine Committee created not only the Holy Land Foundation, but a number of other Islamist entities in the U.S. The leaders of one of those entities, the Islamic Association for Palestine, subsequently created CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which was cited as an unindicted co-conspirator in the case. Mr. McCarthy goes on to point out that documents recovered by the FBI at the home of a Brotherhood operative established the Brotherhood's overarching role in the Hamas support scheme, including bylaws showing the Brotherhood had directed the collection of donations for the Islamic resistance movement, which is Hamas. Also recovered at the time was the internal memorandum in which the Brotherhood's American leadership asserted, quote, the Ikhwan, i.e. the Brotherhood, must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. And in fact, when you get a copy of the Fifth Circuit's opinion, there are a number of interesting things addressed by the Fifth Circuit with regard to the Holy Land Foundation. The Fifth Circuit said, my friend from California, Mr. Dyer, wished to be heard. I certainly yield.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask him to yield momentarily in just a moment, so please proceed.
Okay. The Fifth Circuit said, "We are satisfied that independent evidence also established the existence of a joint venture or combination among the declarants and the defendants to support Hamas through the Holy Land Foundation and the Zagat committees. For example, participants at the Philadelphia meeting discussed Hamas and its control of the Zagat committees. The participants referenced the importance of the Holy Land Foundation and the committee's goals, and they identified as, quote, ours, unquote, various Zagat committees to which Holy Land Foundation donated funds. The government also introduced evidence of numerous financial transactions and personal contact between the defendants and Hamas leader Marzouk, who was listed in the El Barassi and Shakar documents as chairman of the Palestine Committee. Marzouk also had in his personal phone book the contact information for Baker, Elashi, El Mazin, and El Barassi. Further, Hamas leader Michel spoke at a meeting attended by Baker, Elashi, El Mazin, and Ashkar about supporting Hamas. According to Zaborge, who was present, El Mazin led a breakout group at that meeting to discuss the financial issue of raising money. Moreover, Zaborge specifically testified from personal knowledge that the Holy Land Foundation was part of Hamas. Ready?
I appreciate,
yield to my friend.
I thank my friend for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privilege report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 491, resolution providing for consideration of the bill, H.R. 3630, to provide incentives for the creation of jobs and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed.
And, Mr. Speaker, let me express my appreciation to my very good friend for yielding, and to say that the measure that we just filed is so that we'll be able to bring up our effort to create jobs and get this economy moving together, and we'll be doing on the House floor tomorrow. And so I thank my friend for yielding me the time, Mr. Speaker.
No, the Rules Committee, having appeared before it numerous times, has a thankless job. Appreciate the gentleman from California's efforts, usually late into the night as he is working tonight. Well, the Fifth Circuit, talking about the Holy Land Foundation trial, said the evidence at issue was offered to show the defendant's connection to terrorists and his predisposition to terrorist activities. And it goes on to cite much of the evidence. And the court says the evidence in this case does show a relationship between the defendants and El Barassi and Ashkar, as well as their connections to Hamas leaders. It goes on to say the record here showed the defendants' joint participation in a shared undertaking involving the committee, that's the Palestine Committee, and the documents were properly admitted. The court goes on, makes numerous findings, discusses the law, but also says the defendants here are wrong to suggest that it is necessary to know the precise identity of the declarants in the El Barassi and Ashkar documents. And they go on to conclude it's inescapable that the declarants were joint venturers with the defendants in supporting Hamas through the Palestine Committee. And it goes on to cite some examples there. The Fifth Circuit did an excellent job of going through, reciting the evidence, and they said this. They were also consistent with security guidelines found among Holy Land Foundation's materials stored at Infocom, which directed that there should be cover stories agreed upon to explain things like meetings and travel. Now, if this group that worked through the Holy Land Foundation to send money to Hamas were perfectly innocent, then it seems interesting that the Foundation's policies and guidelines that were found in Virginia in a sub-basement which contained much of the Muslim Brotherhood's archives would say the following, and this is from a footnote on page 84 of the Fifth Circuit's decision. They said the document, which was labeled the Foundation's Policy and Guidelines, included comprehensive policies for ensuring the secrecy of the organization's activity. For example, the policies directed that documents should be arranged at meetings so they could be easily gotten rid of in an emergency. That measures should be taken before a meeting to be sure there is no hidden surveillance equipment. That an alert signal should be given if the location is monitored or if a member of the committee is followed. And the documents should be hidden when traveling, and a pretext should be devised in the case they're discovered in a search. The possession of such a document by a purportedly charitable organization was clearly suspicious. And the Fifth Circuit there is a master of understatement. It is amazing what was found in the documentation in Virginia. And that's after a couple were arrested as they went across the Chesapeake Bridge, photographing construction columns of the bridge. And on further search of their home in Virginia, sub-basement, they found the Muslim Brotherhood archives that gave us so much information. Trouble is, there were massive numbers of boxes of information, and as we understand it, much of that was provided to the defendants in the Holy Land Foundation trial. I made the request of the Attorney General last week that since those documents were provided to defendants who were convicted of funding terrorism, funneling money to Hamas, that surely the Justice Department would now allow Congress to see those boxes of documents. The Attorney General, once again, didn't know what was furnished. He would look into it. We need an Attorney General that knows what's going on when there are organizations in America who are financing by millions and millions of dollars people who are conducting terrorism efforts around the world. Well, the Attorney General said he'd look into it. An official request was made at the hearing, and yet we're waiting to hear from the Justice Department. It just seems to make sense to me that if this Justice Department will provide documentation to people who are part of a terrorist network, then surely they'll provide them to Congress. But then again, that remains to be seen. We had an article here from Fox News on December 7th. It reports that Senator Susan Collins, on Wednesday blasted the Defense Department for classifying the Fort Hood massacre as workplace violence and suggested political correctness is being placed above the security of the nation's armed forces at home. During a joint session of the Senate and House Homeland Security Committee on Wednesday, the Maine Republican referenced a letter from the Defense Department depicting the Fort Hood shootings as workplace violence. She criticized the Obama administration for failing to identify the threat as radical Islam. 13 people were killed and dozens more were wounded at Fort Hood in 2009, and the number of alleged plots targeting the military has grown significantly since then. Lawmakers said there have been 33 plots against the U.S. military since September 11, 2001, and 70% of those threats have been since mid-2009, during this administration. Major Nadal Hassan, a former Army psychiatrist who is being held for the attacks, allegedly was inspired by radical U.S.-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Yemen in late September, and who parenthetically was leading a prayer session of Capitol Hill Muslim staffers just years before here in our Capitol complex. Anyway, continuing with the article, the two men exchanged as many as 20 emails, according to U.S. officials, and Al-Awlaki declared Hassan a hero. Chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, Connecticut Independent Senator Joe Lieberman, said the military has become a direct target of violent Islamist extremism within the United States. This is Senator Lieberman's words, the stark reality is that the American service member is increasingly in the terrorist scope and not just overseas in a traditional war setting, Lieberman told Fox News before the start of Wednesday's hearings. In June, two men allegedly plotted to attack a Seattle, Washington military installation using guns and grenades. In July, Army Private Nasser Abdo was accused of planning a second attack at Fort Hood. And, Mr. Speaker, might I ask how much time remains?
14 minutes.
Okay, thank you. With regard to Private Nasser Abdo, it's worth noting that we have people who have been banned now from briefing our justice officials, intelligence officials, State Department officials on the threat of radical Islam. There was even a memo put together, provided in this administration, which by name pointed to Army Private Nasser Abdo and said, this guy has been in uniform on Al Jazeera, basically saying he's going to do what Major Hassan did at Fort Hood. He's going to do it at Fort Hood. This administration is so interested in protecting radical Islam and not offending radical Islam that that memo was trash can, never went anywhere. And the only way this private was stopped was not by our intelligence community, not by our Justice Department, not by our State Department, not with all the information they could have. It was stopped by a gun dealer who just believed something was wrong, and he notified law enforcement. And now we know from the 9/11 Commission, I mean, we've known since the Commission that came out with its report, there are hundreds of mentions of things like jihad, Islam. Not that there is any war on Islam. There is not. Thank God that the vast majority of Muslims know that we're not at war with them, and they are not at war with us. But it is insanity not to protect ourselves and educate ourselves on that small group, that small percentage, it's a large group of radical Islamists who have declared war on us. And now this administration, though originally after 9/11, the Bush administration, the independent 9/11 Commission that was appointed, came out saying this is a result of radical Islam. Now the Justice Department, the intelligence community, the new lexicon will not allow the usage and training of words like Islam, jihad, the very things that led to over 3,000 Americans being killed and brought about wars that killed thousands more. The war goes on, but as one individual who is fighting for us said, this administration is making us blind ourselves so we cannot see the people we are fighting. There was a conference at Langley, CIA headquarters, that was canceled by this administration. Why? Because CARE complained to the White House. And they saw, the report is that that's how the conference was stopped. CARE complained to the administration, and they stopped it. And now the administration has gone through and come out with a new methodology of selecting people who will be allowed to brief our intelligence officials, will be allowed to brief our justice officials, will be allowed to brief our military, and they will not be allowed to use terms like radical Islam. That those are, in this administration's mind, hateful terminology rather than helping us classify and figure out who it is that is on our side and who it is that is against us. There's even a report out that this administration now, in the last week, is going to create a new category on the terrorist watch list, which would be called former military detainees. If that ended up being true, makes you wonder why they'd create a new category now. Are they about to release military detainees? And so when they come into the country or they're in our country trying to fly, we'll know who it is trying to kill us here? This administration has blinded the people that are trying to fight the war against radical Islam, which is at war with us. We've seen to it that it looks like a procedure in both Libya and in Egypt are going to likely result in radical Islamists controlling those countries. The Middle East has become a powder keg, far more so than it ever has. And if you go back and look at the President's speech, back I believe it was in May, recently looked at a transcript where our own President said Israel is going to have to defend itself by itself. Now, thankfully, as we saw when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke here in this body, we had both sides of the aisle repeatedly stand in support of the things Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying. Israel has been our friend. They've been our ally. Muslims are allowed to worship Islam in Israel just as Muslims are allowed to do here in the U.S. It would be nice if Christians were allowed to worship in Muslim countries, but their definition of freedom does not allow people to freely worship whom they wish. It only allows them the freedom to worship under Islam. Even in Afghanistan, the last Christian church has now closed. The kind of freedom that American lives and treasure brought to Afghanistan now means you can't have an open Christian church in Afghanistan. And then we find out this administration was indirectly negotiating with terrorists, with the Taliban, with regard to Afghanistan about a year and a half ago. There were a few of us that met with leaders of the Northern Alliance a year and a half or so ago, and they're the first ones that told us, your administration is indirectly meeting and negotiating with terrorists, with the Taliban, the people we fought with you to defeat. And after we defeated them in 3 or 4 months, then we started putting in tens of thousands of soldiers, military, into Afghanistan, and we went from being embedded to being occupiers. And we oversaw the creation of a constitution in Afghanistan that says Sharia law will reign, which means there will be no Christian churches in Afghanistan, when true Sharia law is in charge. One of the things that were found in the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood, they have a 10-year goal that began in 2005. For one thing, anybody that raises any issue about people, the tiny percentage of Muslims who are at war with us, the radical Islamists, anybody that raises anything about the radical Islamists at war with us is to be called an Islamophobe. That term originated with the Organization of Islamic Conference, composed of 57 states. 57 states. And they're the ones that came up with that. And they came up with the notion of branding anyone who says anything negative about radical Islam trying to destroy America, brand them an Islamophobe. So anytime anyone, Mr. Speaker, sees the term Islamophobe or Islamophobia, they should know exactly where it originated. It originated with the OIC, the 57 states of the OIC, who are also helping fund, through other entities and individuals, courses at some of our nation's formerly best schools who've showed they're for sale. Their souls are for sale, that if someone will give them enough money, then they will put on seminars and put on classes that will also call people Islamophobes and talk about Islamophobia, about anyone who raises any issue about radical Islam trying to destroy our way of life. And the goal mentioned as part of the 10-year goal in 2005 was, by 2015, to have subverted our U.S. Constitution to Sharia law. And the method for doing that, we've been seeing it take place, is to subvert America's First Amendment rights to Sharia. One of the ways that that is being effectuated is that when some nut burns a Quran in Florida, then people get killed in some riot in Afghanistan, and then even fine upstanding Americans say, see, we probably need a law that prohibits burning a Quran, that prohibits saying anything bad about the Quran or radical Islam, because that's going to get Americans killed. So let's have a law banning people saying anything negative or burning a Quran. Never mind the fact that for our country's history, we find out it's not against the Constitution to burn an American flag, not against the Constitution to burn a Bible, not against the Constitution to take a cross symbolizing that thing on which Jesus was crucified and put it in a beaker of urine. In fact, the federal government will even give money to have that done. But if anybody says anything negative about the crime, let's make that a crime. There are well-intentioned people in this Capitol who are thinking maybe we need a law like that, and when people push that kind of law, they are moving to subvert our United States First Amendment rights under the Constitution to Sharia law. And once that were to happen, then that goal can be checked off of the goals that were established by the Muslim Brotherhood in 2005. They're hoping to get that done by 2015. A great way to do that is to brand people like me or people in the Justice Department or trainers who would teach people about the ideas of radical Islam as Islamophobes, and continue to have courses they fund to encourage laws to prevent Islamophobia, so that they have laws that prevent anybody from saying anything negative about Sharia. Never mind, even on a television program today, an atheist called Christianity a hate religion. Said it's hateful, you know, basically, in fact, because Jesus, he said, created a hell. And that's why we shouldn't admire Christmas. Well, some of us know that Jesus was not likely born in December, but more likely in the springtime when shepherds are on the hills. But to declare what our founders knew would be an important core building block of this country, when they knew that the best things that ever happened to this country would come as a result of reliance on the teachings of Jesus and the teachings in the Bible, you had comments like George Washington in his resignation saying, and I'll close with this, he prayed that Americans would follow the teaching of the divine author of our blessed religion without an humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation. He was right. With that, I yield back.